Hello class. Today I am going to read you a story that I personally love because it discusses two very important women in history. And this book is Amelia and Eleanor Go for a Ride. Amelia being Amelia Earhart, who was the first woman to fly by herself across the Atlantic Ocean, and Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the first lady, which means that she was the wife of President Roosevelt, and she was also an activist. Now, these two women formed a friendship in a time where women were not necessarily believed to be as strong as their men counterparts. So this story is going to show you two very strong women and how they formed a friendship and something that they did together that was very surprising. So this is Amelia and Eleanor Go for a Ride by Pam Munoz Ryan and pictures by Brian Selznick, and this was published in 1999. Amelia and Eleanor were birds of a feather. Eleanor was outspoken and determined. So was Amelia. Amelia was daring and liked to try things other women wouldn't even consider. Eleanor was the very same. So when Eleanor discovered that her friend Amelia was coming to town to give a speech, she naturally said, "Bring your husband and come to dinner at my house, and you can even stay the night." It wasn't unusual for two friends to get together, but Eleanor was Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady of the United States, who lived in the White House with her husband, President Franklin Roosevelt. So this is Eleanor Roosevelt. Amelia was Amelia Earhart, the celebrated aviator who had been the first female pilot to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean. And when two of the most famous and adventurous women in the world got together, something exciting was bound to happen. And that's Amelia. I wonder what they're going to do. What do you think they're going to do together? Well, let's see, Washington, D.C. What house is that? Who lives there? I think I've seen this house before on the maybe some money? In a guest room at the White House, Amelia and her husband, GP, dressed for dinner. Amelia pulled on long white evening gloves that were so different from the ones she sometimes wore while flying. Many women didn't understand why a woman would want to risk her life in a plane, but Amelia had said it more than once. It's for the fun of it. Besides, she loved the feeling of independence she had when she was in the cockpit. She carefully folded a gift for Eleanor, a silk scarf that matched her own. The powder blue with streaks of indigo reminded Amelia of the morning sky. Meanwhile, Eleanor dressed for dinner too. Her brother Hal would be escorting her this evening because the president had a meeting to attend, but Eleanor was used to that. She pulled on the long white evening gloves that were so different from the ones she sometimes wore while driving. Then she peeked out the window at the brand new car that had just been delivered that afternoon. She couldn't wait to drive it. Many people thought it was too bold and dangerous for a woman to drive a car, especially the First Lady of the United States, but Eleanor always gave the same answer. It's practical, that's all. Besides, she loved the feeling of independence she had when she was behind the wheel. It was a brisk and cloudless April evening. The guests had gathered in the Red Room, and the table looked elegant, as even small dinner parties at the White House can be. Eleanor and Hal greeted Amelia and GP, as well as several reporters and a photographer. Amelia gave Eleanor the scarf. "I love it," Eleanor exclaimed. "It's just like yours." Dinner started with George Washington's crab chowder. Ooh, I wonder if you guys have ever had crab chowder before. "This is delicious," said Amelia. "But if soup at the White House has such a fancy name, what will dessert be called?" Perhaps Abraham Lincoln's peach cobbler, or maybe Thomas Jefferson's custard? They laughed as everyone took turns guessing. By the time they got to the roast duck, the conversation had turned to flying. Mrs. Roosevelt just received her student's pilot's license, said one of the reporters. Amelia wasn't surprised. She had been the one to encourage Eleanor. She knew her friend could do anything she set her mind to. I'll teach you myself, offered Amelia. I accept. Tell us, Amelia, what's it like to fly at night in the dark? Everyone at the table leaned closer to hear. Very few people in the whole world had ever flown at night, and Amelia was one of them. Amelia's eyes sparkled. The stars glitter all about and seem close enough to touch. At higher elevations, the clouds below shine white with dark islands where the night sea shows through. I've seen the planet Venus setting on the horizon, and I've circled cities of twinkling lights. We've studied Venus before. And the capital city at night? Asked Eleanor. There's no describing it, said Amelia. You just have to experience it on a clear night when you can see forever. Why, we should go tonight. We could fly the loop to Baltimore and back in no time. The Secret Service men protested. This hasn't been approved. Nonsense, said Eleanor. If Amelia Earhart can fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean, I can certainly take a short flight to Baltimore and back. Before dessert could be served, Amelia had called Eastern Air Transport and arranged a flight. What are they about to do? Within the hour, Amelia and Eleanor boarded the Curtiss Condor twin-motor airplane. For a moment, both women looked up at the mysterious night sky. Then, without changing her gloves, Amelia slipped into the cockpit and took the wheel. The plane rolled down the runway, faster and faster. Lights from the airstrip flashed in front of them, and they lifted into the dark. How amusing is it to see a girl in a white evening dress and high-heeled shoes flying a plane, Eleanor said. Amelia laughed as she made a wide sweep over Washington and turned off all the lights in the plane. Out the window, the Potomac River glistened with moonshine. The Capitol dome reflected a soft golden halo, and the enormous light-drenched monuments looked like tiny miniature toys. Soon the peaceful countryside gave way to shadowy woodlands. The Chesapeake Bay became a meandering outline on the horizon, and even though they knew it wasn't so, it seemed as if the plane crawled slowly through star-struck space. Eleanor marveled. It's like sitting on top of the world. And that was their view. Wow. When it was time to land, Amelia carefully took the plane down. A group of reporters had gathered, anxious to ask questions. Mrs. Roosevelt, did you feel safe knowing a girl was flying that ship? Just as safe, said Eleanor. Did you fly the plane, Mrs. Roosevelt? Asked one reporter. What part did you like best? Said another. I enjoyed it so much, and no, I didn't actually fly the plane, not yet. But someday, I intend to. I was thrilled by the city lights, the brilliance of the blinking pinpoints below. Amelia smiled. She knew just how Eleanor felt. I wonder why they asked if they felt safe knowing that a girl was flying the plane. As the Secret Service agents drove them slowly back to the White House, Amelia and Eleanor agreed that there was nothing quite as exciting as flying. What could compare? Well, they admitted, maybe the closest thing would be driving in a fast car on a straightaway road with a stiff breeze blowing against your face. Arms linked, they walked up the steps to the White House. Eleanor whispered something to Amelia, and then they hesitated, letting the rest of the group walk ahead of them. "Are you coming inside, Mrs. Roosevelt?" someone asked. But by then, they had wrapped their silk scarves around their necks, and they were hurrying toward... Wonder where they were going. Looks like they're going towards Eleanor's new car. Without changing her gloves, Eleanor quickly slipped into the driver's seat and took her turn at the wheel. With the wind at her hair and the brisk air stinging their cheeks, they knew that they were flying down this road. And after they had taken a ride about the city streets of Washington, D.C., they finally headed back to the White House. For dessert, Eleanor Roosevelt's pink clouds on angel food cake. The end. And in the back, it even gives you a recipe for Eleanor Roosevelt's pink clouds on angel food cake. So if you ever want to make this, that is an option. I can upload that as well. Ooh, we have an author's note on the back here that I think is important to read. Amelia and Eleanor. Just mentioning their names brings choruses of, "They're my heroes," or "I've always loved and admired them." So when I found an obscure reference to their night flight, I couldn't wait to write a story about it, if only it were true. I sat in the library and scanned rolls and rolls of newspaper film and finally found the Associated Press articles. Later, Brian Selznick found a photograph from that very evening. The incident really happened. In 1932, Amelia Earhart did what was then considered unthinkable. She flew solo across the Atlantic Ocean to demonstrate that women like to do such things, and they can. The world reacted with unbridled excitement. In addition to Amelia's flying achievements, she made her mark in other ways. In the 1930s, she disapproved of the special minimum wage law for women, which was lower than that for men, and she fought for equal rights for men and women. After her famous flight, she was invited to speak at many functions where she discussed her political views as well as her experiences flying. In 1932, Eleanor Roosevelt was asked to introduce Amelia at one of these speeches, and that's how they met. Eleanor Roosevelt moved into the White House in 1933 during the Great Depression. She transformed the role of First Lady by becoming a commanding role model. When the country went on food rationing, she insisted that the White House do the same. When cars became increasingly popular, she drove one despite the criticism. When she saw inequality, she became an activist for women's and human rights. Her practical approach to issues gained her enormous respect. Many people have said she was a woman ahead of her time. She would have said it was just common sense. Eleanor loved flying and did receive her student's pilot's license with encouragement from Amelia, who intended to teach her. Eleanor sent the license to Amelia as proof that she was ready to begin her training, but Franklin, the president, discouraged the plan. They could not afford an airplane, and it was a risk that he did not wish her to take. And Eleanor agreed, but she continued to love and promote air travel. She flew more passenger miles in the 1920s and 30s than any other woman in the world. On April 20th, 1933, Amelia and her husband, G.P. Putnam, were invited to spend the night at the White House. Amelia was in town to give a speech the next day to the Daughters of the American Revolution. That night, still in formal dresses and white gloves, Amelia arranged to take Eleanor for a flight over Washington, D.C. Although Amelia did take the controls for part of the flight, The plane was also flown by 2 of Eastern Air Transport's pilots due to regulations, so the ladies weren't the only ones who were flying the plane. For this fictionalized book, though, it seemed just a little bit more exciting to have 2 good friends and brave women alone on this wonderful adventure. Eleanor did take a turn in the cockpit, where the pilot explained the controls to her, and when the plane took an unexpected dip, the reporters joked that the First Lady was flying it. Almost all of Amelia and Eleanor's dialogue in my story comes from newspaper accounts, books, and diaries. Eleanor loved cars and driving. Some people said she liked to drive fast. Whether or not there was a new car waiting when she got back from the airport remains a little bit of a speculation. One research account supports the story, and I love that idea, and I thought they might have really snuck away together. Amelia recorded herself that they ate crab chowder for dinner that night, and she mentioned it in her thank you note to Eleanor. Amelia Earhart and Eleanor Roosevelt were remarkable women who mesmerized the public with their lives. Sadly, in 1937, in an attempt to be the first woman to fly around the world, Amelia and her plane mysteriously vanished somewhere over the South Pacific, and she was never heard from again. In 1938, a year after Amelia Earhart's tragic disappearance, her husband, G.P., found Eleanor Roosevelt's student pilot's license among Amelia's papers. He wrote to Mrs. Roosevelt and enclosed the license as a memento of the time when Eleanor Roosevelt almost became Amelia Earhart's star pupil. So that is the true story behind how this story was written. Thank you so much for listening.